Hi everybody, and welcome back to my Let's Make CRUD series. Today I'm going to work with the simplest of our tables, the species table, and I'm going to start writing the unit tests for the create function and the read function. So let's get into that. Okay, I'm going to start with a boilerplate unit test file. This you can find online anywhere, or you can have an IDE create one for you. Next, I'm importing my SQL context. This is just how I'm going to connect to my database. I also will be having a video detailing how I created that context coming out at some point in the future, hopefully. So look forward to that. I'm also going to start writing my unit test names. I'm naming the class species create because that means that this collection of tests is testing the species create function. And I'm also going to create a setup function. This will just run at the beginning of each test. And what I'm doing here is I'm going to refresh the database so that there's nothing in it, at least for the create context here. This will allow me to be able to check that only the stuff that I've created or not created, if an error happens, is in the database. And there's no miscellaneous information that I might have held over from somewhere else. So I'm going to start with the drop query. In this case, I will be dropping the adoption agency test database. That's what I'm going to use to test all of my tests, really. And I'm going to just drop that so that it just clears out. And I'm going to add another SQL query here, which will be create database adoption agency test. That will allow me to run the code that I wrote in the last video for the database schema to this database, and that will allow me to test on it. So next I'm going to write another SQL context here. This one will connect directly to the adoption agency test database, so I don't have to specify the database in the queries that I'm running. So here, I'm also going to open my SQL file where I wrote all of the schema to. And to open that, I'm just using the Python built-in function open. That allows me to open a file that's accessible by the program as a context similar to the SQL context. That means that when I leave the context, when I go outside of the indentation there, it will actually close the file so I don't have a bunch of memory leaks. I'm also going to import from my package where the adoption CRUD files are, just everything that I need. Right now there's actually nothing in there. I'm just setting that up so that when I run these, I can just keep adding to the adoption CRUD without having to add anything to this file here. So now that I've got the setup done, I can move on to the actual tests. So here for the test no name, I'm going to try to test to see whether or not the function returns a exception, which is an error, if create species has none passed in for the name. Now I can get rid of some of that boilerplate there, and I can move on to the next test. This one's going to test whether or not it succeeds if the name is unique, because I want to make sure that all the species names are unique to each other. So a person can't add multiple unless there's some that are deactivated. So here, just to make things easier, I'm putting a a variable with test name as its value. That way I can check it and pass it in multiple places without having to change it later if I want to change it to test name 1 or something like that. So now I'm opening up another SQL context into the test database. There, I'm going to check whether or not the create species function actually inserted a new species into the database. So here, I'm just going to select all columns from species, and now I'm going to get all of the results from that query. I'm also going to just check to see if one with the name that I have here was inserted. So I'm filtering by that. And now I'm checking that the results is equal to 1. So, or the length of the results is equal to 1. That means that there's only one result from that query. Then I'm going to check that the results at the first index, which is just the only item in the list, equals this, which is 1 because it's auto-incrementing starting at 1 for the ID, name, which is the name we passed in, and is active should default to 1. So now that I have that test name unique there, I can go ahead and test whether or not it fails if if the name is not unique. So now I'm making another context into that database, and I'm going to insert a row into the species table with that name there. And I'm just making sure that I don't have any errors in that. So insert into species. Here I'm getting a little bit confused. I realized later on that that is not the correct syntax for inserting into. I'm pretty sure I fix it at some point in this video, but if not, just letting you know. The proper format is actually the parentheses, the column names, space values, parentheses, the values you're inserting. So now that I have that, I'm going to create the species, but I'm also going to check that creating it raises an exception, in this case duplicate information. By the way, these exceptions aren't actually built into Python here. I'm just naming them what I want them to be later on, so that I'm just naming them duplicate information, for example. So now that that test is done, I'm going to test if something is unique in the actives. So in this case, for the test name not unique, it's not unique in general because there's another row in there that it has its name specifically. But in this case, I'm inserting another row into the species, but its active is 0, meaning that it doesn't actually show up in any lists. That way, people should be able to add more because we don't want to delete information, but if they, for some reason, deactivated a species, we want to be able to add a new one if we want it, for whatever reason. So I'm double checking that that works, and that's the create tests. I can add more later if I want to get more fancy with the species table, but in the meantime, this will be good. So I'm just copying the format that I had for the create there into the read, but I also realized that I didn't have a teardown function for the class. This is basically saying after all the tests are run, we want to do this. In this case, I want to destroy the database because I want it to be fresh for the next tests to happen, and I also don't really care what happens to the test database outside of when I'm actually testing. So back to the read here. I'm adding a list of test names. This way I can just loop through them and insert them into the database without having a bunch of redundant lines. I'm also adding them to a setup class function. This will just run at the beginning of each class creation because in the read I'm not actually changing the database, but I do want a static template to work off of. So here I did the normal running of all of the schema information, and then I'm also going to run a query for each of the test species where I'm just going to insert into the species table a row with the name of the species that I'm on in this for loop. So I'm just going to do this, and I wonder if I'm actually going to remember how to do inserts correctly here, which I am. Okay, so this is actually the right format for inserting into a SQL or MySQL database. I have the name and is active, which are the values that I'm assigning intentionally because the ID auto increments and I don't have to worry about that. I'm also adding another query where the isActive is 0, just to test different ways of filtering the data coming back. And here I realized that I had used the insert into incorrectly for these two tests. So I'm fixing that here and just adding the little quotations so that it's actually passing incorrectly. And adding the quotations there because then it will interpret it as a string when it's actually passed to the database. And I'm just fixing that here and fixing that here. Very glad that I actually did fix this in this video. And this, kids, is why you shouldn't go off your memory when you're programming. It probably would have turned out a lot better if I had actually just went, oh wait, I'm not sure about inserting into, and just looked it up on W3 School. So here I'm just cleaning it up, making sure that everything looks correct for all the tests, fixing all my bugs here. Fixing that there, double checking. Okay, now we can get back to the actual tests. So going back to the read tests, I'm going to go ahead and start with the tear down here, just making sure that I actually do tear down and destroy the database when I'm done with all the tests for the read class. So first test, easy one, get all of the results. I don't care if they're active, inactive, whatever. So I'm going to say results equals read species. And from there, I'm going to check that it's actually equal to a list of dictionaries where the first element has ID 1 and name test name 1 and isActive is 1 as well. Then the second element, because I created a inactive version of that row, should be 0 for the isActive. And I'm just going through with all of the increments because it should be test 1, test 1, test 2, test 2, then test 3, test 3. And each of them should have their own ID that's 1 greater than the last one. And I'm going through and adding the inactive flags here. There we go, and that should be the results of reading without any filters because that's the entirety of the species table. Looks good, and next one I can do is the test get all active. So this should be similar to that list that I created above, but all of the items that are flagged as inactive should not be in the list. So I'm just going to do similar thing, results equals read species. And because I haven't written the function yet, I can do whatever I want here. I'm just going to say isActive equals 1 because it's pretty simple to filter that way. And I deleted all that. Now we can get all of the inactive ones. I'm not sure if we would ever need to do this, but it's testing the functionality of that isActive parameter in the read species file. Function, the read species function. Okay. Now we're going to do a test for searching by a column. First, I was trying to figure out what to name this. I just kind of settled on test get all with token and name. In this case, we're going to not search, so we're not searching every single column, but we're going to search by column where we just pass in the column and the value that we're searching by. So this should present all of the species with 1 in the name. And because we're not filtering by active status, it should just be the first 2 values. Now we can do isActive on top of that, and it should just be the first value. Now we're doing another test for the species where we're getting a specific ID in the species table. So here I'm going to say results equals read species, and it looks like I misspelled species there, where the ID equals 1. So that should just get the first value. I'm doing an underscore ID here because ID is already taken in the namespace of Python. So in this case, I'm just doing underscore ID, and it works perfectly fine. And here I can get by IDs, where I just pass a list into it, and that should get me the first and third items. Now, I haven't actually sat down and written a really in-depth spec about what I want the read function to do, so that's about it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I will be putting out a second part to this where I finish up the update, delete, deactivate, and activate functions for this table. It just got really long, and I didn't want to put you guys through a 40-minute video. Hope you all have a great day, and see you next time.